Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled The Battle Against Fake News in Brazil's 2022 Elections. My name is Sidney Chalhoub, and I am a professor of history and African Afro-American studies at Harvard University. I will limit my participation to introducing our event before handing the baton over to our moderator, Natalia Viana, current Nieman Fellow here at Harvard and co-founder and co-director of Agência Pública, Brazil's first nonprofit investigative news agency. Thank you, Natalia and Agência Pública for co-sponsoring this important discussion. Our thanks also to Pacto, pela Democracia for helping promote this event. Today's event will be held in English with simultaneous translation to Portuguese. Please click on the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen to access the Portuguese channel. Many thanks to our interpreters, Glenda de la Fuente and Henrique Cotrim, for your hard work. Para nosso público no Brasil, cliquem no botão de interpretação na parte inferior de sua tela para acessar o canal de tradução simultânea para o português. I'm pleased and honored to introduce today's speakers in the order in which they will present. First, we'll hear from Wardle, co-founder and US director of First Draft, the world's foremost nonprofit focused on research and practice to address mis- and disinformation. Claire is a leading expert on user-generated content, verification, and misinformation, and has worked with newsroom and humanitarian organizations around the world, providing training and consultancy on digital transformation. Next, we'll hear from David Nemer, who is currently a faculty associate here at Harvard's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, as well as an assistant professor of media studies and affiliated faculty in Latin American studies at the University of Virginia. We're also joined by Pablo Ortellado, professor of public policy and advisor in the postgraduate program in cultural studies at USP. Pablo also coordinates the research group on public policies for access to information. So the rationale for the conversation, which is in the blog for the event, as Brazilian presidential elections approach, researchers are unanimous to point out that fake news and misinformation campaign will be core threats to a transparent, fair process. The president has already started questioning the legitimacy of the Brazilian electoral system and calling previous elections rigged, much like Donald Trump did in 2016 and 2020. So what are the real risks? What needs to be done so that we don't see a repetition of the big lie of US elections play out in Brazil? So we will record today's webinar and publish it on the Dr. Class YouTube channel in the coming weeks. We'll also email a link of the recording to all who registered. We hope to see you at some of our other events. In the chat, we've added links to our online calendar as well as social and media channels. I encourage you all to follow us there for the most up-to-date information on upcoming events. We'd love to hear from you today. If you have a question for our speakers, please send it through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We will be answering questions at the end of the session, but feel free to submit them at any time. So without further ado, I'd like to begin by welcoming our first speaker, Wardle.
Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here. To be clear, I did quite a lot of work around the 2018 Brazilian election. I am not an expert on current situations in Brazil, but I am an expert in the disaster that is the American context. And there is a lot of learnings around dis and misinformation in elections and what has happened in the US, and with some knowledge of Brazil, my concerns about what might happen there. But I think it's important to note that there are 22 elections this year in 2022. And there was an excellent op-ed in the Boston Globe yesterday, basically saying we need to have an ongoing response to misinformation on elections, because what happens is funders and interest kind of lurches from election to election, as if misinformation only starts 12 weeks before an election and ends on the day of the ballot. It's kind of astonishing to me in 2022 that we still don't have ongoing programs to build resilience and to protect democracy, and instead we go from event to event. So particularly around the platforms. So for example, if we take the US, actually, as we know, Donald Trump was sowing the seeds of this idea that the election couldn't be believed. Even in 2015, he was setting himself up even before his victory in 2016, saying, oh, if I lose, it's rigged. Well, it turns out he won, so he kept quiet for 2 years. And then from 2018, he kept sowing the seeds of, we won't be able to trust this election. And in the summer of 2020, he tweeted continuously about mail-in ballots were going to be fraudulent. Now, there's lots of conversations about, well, Twitter labeled Donald Trump's tweets. They only started labeling in mid-September of 2020. That whole summer of this drumbeat from Donald Trump, there was no platform policies. And most platforms only rolled out policies related to what happens if a candidate doesn't accept the results in October of 2020. And in fact, Twitter now, if anybody talks about the fraudulent nature of 2020, there's no Twitter policy now in 2022 for anything that's happening now. So the complete failure of the technology companies to be prepared for what we already know is very likely to happen is a massive issue. So just to say, there is no easy solution to these challenges. And everybody on this call, and in fact, everybody in the audience knows this. It's a mixture of platforms taking more action, journalists taking more action, community-based organizations taking more action. We need a whole suite of, it's like a toolbox. There's no one magic tool, we need all of them. And I'll just talk a little bit about our experiences of working with journalists that I think are a really critical part of that toolbox. But in France, in the spring of 2017, just after the 2016 victory of Trump, but also Duterte in the Philippines, French journalists said, how can we be prepared? And so we actually worked with a coalition of 34 French newsrooms to build out what we called, which was cross-check, which was this idea that one of the major vulnerabilities of newsrooms is that they compete. And that actually, if they work together, then there's less likely to be a vulnerability. We did that in France very successfully with logos sitting alongside, showing that journalists were working together. And when we did the evaluation, what became clear was a number of people said, I don't trust the Parisian media. I don't read Le Monde, don't trust them, but I do trust my local newsroom. And the fact that the local newsroom was in your collaboration meant that I trusted what Crosscheck was publishing. So we came out of that feeling very positive, and in 2018 worked with a number of amazing journalists in Brazil to create Comprova. And Comprova lives on. As I just said, lots of election projects get funded for the election and then all the funders disappear and people move on. The most amazing thing about Comprova is that it has continued and it is now bigger. There are more newsrooms involved. But for me, what was so interesting was that no newsroom should be competing about the scoop of disinformation. It's hard enough to do this work. And when journalists work together, it can be much more effective. So Comprova continues in Brazil, and fingers crossed that will continue to help Brazilian voters understand what's true or not. But as we know, in societies that are polarized, there is a good 50% of Brazilians that go nowhere near Comprova or any of the newsrooms that are part of that collaboration. And it's the same in the US, very polarized information ecosystems where people who consume one type of media go nowhere near the other side. And that's, I think, the biggest problem here is how do we reach those people who are not going to pay if we increasingly have paywalls? They do not want to read information that challenges their worldview. And unfortunately, in the kind of elections we're looking at now, accurate reporting can be offensive to people who are used to seeking out and consuming information that reinforces their worldview. So I think the one thing I would say in terms of lessons from the US is that the US is one of the biggest exporter of disinformation narratives. And so we're seeing in other countries the perpetuation of the big lie the idea that you can't trust mail-in voting, even in countries like Australia that don't have mail-in voting. So Australia is about to go to the ballot box. We're seeing the repetition of American sourced trends, even if it makes no sense because the electoral system is completely different. So I am very, very, very concerned about all of the different elections this year, that they will all be seen through the lens of the big lie. They will be seen through memes, narratives that have been sourced or inspired by US disinformation agents. And the one thing I would say is, as somebody who has studied this for a long time, I would sometimes say at conferences like this, I'm worried if we don't do enough, in 20 years, we could see a civil war. Little did I think that we would see the kind of events that we saw on January 6th last year so quickly. And I think the one lesson that I took away from Stop the Steal, which was the hashtag that emerged the day after, well, actually the day of, November 3rd was the first time we saw the hashtag emerge, was that the disinformation ecosystem is participatory, it is dynamic, and people feel a sense of agency. So the Stop the Steal hashtag was, send us your examples of what you're seeing at the ballot box. Tell us what you're seeing, how election fraud is happening in your communities. And that was retweeted and shared and collected. And it was, people felt part of a community and they felt like they were being listened to. The information ecosystem that many of us live in is still top-down, linear, and hierarchical. If only we have the experts, if we listen to the experts, we'll be okay. There is a reason that disinformation continues to grow, because people feel like their lives have been turned upside down. They feel like they have no agency. They do not understand why their lives have not turned out the way that they thought they were going to. And conspiratorial actors understand that vulnerability and are playing into it and making people feel heard. They are not passively receiving disinformation. They feel part of something. So if we don't learn the lesson of Stop the Steal, this was like activist politics. It was classic movement politics, and it went from a hashtag to the storming of the Capitol in 2 months. And so that, for me, is what we need to understand, is that it is a networked infrastructure. And instead, when we think, even within the journalism context, if only we put more facts into the ecosystem, we'll be okay. We need to listen to people, we need to work with them. And the final thing I'd say, in a community like Brazil, in 2018, I said, so where are the network of WhatsApp groups that we can push this quality content through? And the journalists quite rightly said, well, that's not our job because we're not activists, we're journalists. So we don't do that kind of community engagement. And I was like, well, who is then? And they were like, well, the other side. And I think that's the biggest lesson, is that how do we think ourselves as people who recognize the networked publics require on the ground work with trusted communicators? And that's not TikTok influencers, that's faith leaders, that's sports coaches, that's people in the community. And that requires the work of experts, fact checkers, journalists with community leaders. And that is hard because those two communities often haven't worked together. So there's still a lot that can be done. I am very worried that 4 years on, we have not learned a lot of lessons from 2018. There's amazing people doing work, but I still think in the months we've got left, there has to be a mindset shift, because I am worried about what might happen in a country like Brazil, because it's so similar to the US. Thank you.
So David Nemer, and
Yes.
From here on, I will let Natalia lead. Okay. So, but David, you have the word. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I agree with Claire. I think we should really be careful. And this is something that I've been analyzing since 2018 and trying to deconstruct and understand the human infrastructure of misinformation. In the US, we had a bigger role of platforms like Facebook and Twitter in terms of disseminating misinformation, disinformation, although these platforms are very impactful in Brazil, but it was right on WhatsApp and now Telegram where disinformation and misinformation are being spread. For those who don't know, these messaging apps require deliberate human action for you to receive and share misinformation. That means that there are human power behind, or human labor, as I like to call, behind this scheme. Since 2018, I've been bringing to light how these human infrastructures work. Back in right in October 2018, I published a piece in The Guardian defining the categories of this human infrastructure, where right in the base you have the so-called ordinary Brazilians that consume the misinformation shared in those pro-Bolsonaro groups. Right in the middle, you have the Bolso army, those who actively work to get misinformation spread across different platforms, as well as they are infiltrated in other WhatsApp groups that are not really politically defined, but to get Bolsonaro's misinformation into those like ecosystems, as well as on the very top, we have the influencers. To differentiate what Claire said, we have the evil influencers where they define the agenda and try to pick and spread which misinformation of that time will be spread. Since then, I've been looking into how different media and different kinds of misinformation have been spread in those ecosystems, WhatsApp and Telegram. It's interesting to see that the money that was there for these people to produce misinformation for WhatsApp and Telegram, the money's not there anymore. And there's a shift in terms of misinformation behavior, where now everything seems to be going on to YouTube, because that's where these disinformers can monetize and get some money, since the money is no longer there to produce misinformation for WhatsApp. Now I'm currently doing a research project at Harvard at Berkman Klein Center, where we are scraping those groups to understand which media are the most shared in those groups. And to no surprise, YouTube links are leading the poll. And along with Natalia, we're trying to grab all these YouTube links, transcribe them, so we can do textual analysis and sentiment analysis to see what kinds of movements are being built with this transmediated way of producing and spreading misinformation, from WhatsApp and Telegram groups to YouTube channels. The big lie has been implemented and started in Brazil way before Trump. In 2018, right after the first round of votes, Bolsonaro claimed that the voting machines were hacked and the system was rigged, because he wanted to win outright right from the first round of votes. He didn't expect, at least in his head, he didn't expect to go to the second round of votes or the runoff against Fernando Haddad of the Workers' Party, which it's not surprising that he went to the runoff, because all of the polls showed that he was not going to win outright in the first round, and eventually he would face Fernando Haddad in the second round. So this was something that was already seeded in the Bolsonarist ecosystems of lies. And this is what he does, because every time he needs to capitalize on a given misinformation, because that sort of misinformation had already spread in those spaces, then it's easy to pick up. And this is what I talk about in my research of the construction of the enemy. Bolsonaro needs to constantly build these enemies to maintain his base animated and motivated to fight for him and to keep sharing misinformation. We've had several Supreme Justices being enemies in those ecosystems, and now voting machines came back last year as the biggest enemies, as Bolsonaro doubled down on his accusations that the electoral system was rigged, because he kept having conversations with folks at the Supreme Court. Then he toned down, but it's not because he's not talking about the rigged system. That doesn't mean that the people that his base is not talking about these things anymore. It is, but they just need a trigger from Bolsonaro to go back and engage in those campaigns to try to delegitimize the electoral system. Of course, we're not in campaign mode anymore. I mean, we're about to start, as well as voting is going to happen, and the polls are telling us that Bolsonaro won't win. I mean, those are the polls right now. And he has said that he's not going to accept the outcome of the election if he loses, just like what Trump did. What is interesting, though, is that in this research that I'm conducting along with Natalia, is that we're trying to map how the insurgency, the Brazilian insurgency, is being built since he first claimed that he wasn't going to accept the elections, which was September 7th last year, which is Brazil's Independence Day. So we're trying to map how people are starting to talk about grabbing guns, having access to guns, joining the so-called bullet clubs or places where you can go and shoot, and then it's an easy way to have access to guns. How people are talking about directions on how to get to the Congress and how to get to the Supreme Court. So though in these systems, these informations, they seem loose, as if there are no connections, we're actually trying to build this timeline and actually try to create some awareness before an insurgency happens and it's too late. One of the criticisms that we get very often is that people say, oh, these are just a couple of nutcases of crazy people, you know, nothing huge is going to happen. But this is a problem. We only need 20 crazy people grabbing guns and storming into the Congress. That has happened before in Brazil in 2013. Different scenario, different situation, but I'm just saying that it can happen. And we only need a few people grabbing guns to do this. And the worst case in Brazil is that we're also going to have elections for governor. And we know that Bolsonaro have identified governors and states as his enemies as well, as he kept blaming governors for many of the things that his government failed to do. So my fear is that those insurgencies will also happen in a local sphere, which is much harder to get attention to and try to dismantle these local insurgencies. So anyways, I'll stop right here and then I'll pass it on to Pablo. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I got the baton. I'm gonna.
Oh yeah, sorry, Natalia.
I caught the button. I'm going to remember people that they can send messages, no questions on the Q&A. Please, Pablo.
Hi, and thank you. I'd like to comment about some of the things that we can do about misinformation in the Brazilian elections in October. I mean, in a sense, there isn't much we can do because I believe we don't think too much that misinformation is a kind of side product, a byproduct of political polarization. So until we have a political solution to the political crisis we're in, there's not really much we can do. However, there are some things that we can do to minimize the damage. And I think there are 4 things that we could do. I mean civil society, Congress, and the platforms, and the social media platforms. And I like to comment on those 4 things. The first thing that we should do, is we must stop funding disinformation. This is something that David just mentioned. There is a lot of debate about how misinformation is funded. There are police investigations, state police, federal police, public prosecution. The Supreme Court did an investigation about who's funding misinformation. We thought there was significant, businessmen funding misinformation. We didn't find much things about that. We thought that maybe politicians were funding with their money from Congress. There was some, but not much. Who's funding misinformation? As far as we can tell, after years of looking into it, the press, Congress, public prosecution, and federal police, what we know who's funding misinformation is Google. It's basically Google who's funding misinformation by monetizing websites with AdSense and by monetizing videos on YouTube. All the money that makes the machine works, it comes, as far as we can see, it comes from Google, from monetization from Google, and Google must act to stop, money going to these machines. They don't require much. All they need is an office space, maybe 1 or 2 people to produce content. It's maybe not too much money, but it's enough for an office to keep building. And we have maybe a few tens of those offices running. And they, as far as we can see, all the money comes from Google, and Google must act. That's the first thing I like to point out. The second thing is the the platforms should be harsher and not softer on politicians. You know, Facebook has this very bad policy that they don't apply certain rules to politicians. And now we have a so-called fake news bill in Congress that puts this into another level. They're saying that posts from politicians could not be moderated, or at least it has an ambiguous language that may be interpreted as that. And that's a big problem, because when we investigate misinformation, often the most important spreaders of misinformation are politicians, are senators, are, you know, representatives in Congress, or so politicians are a big part of the misinformation problem, and they should be treated with more care. Their punishment should be harsher, not softer, because they have more responsibility. What they say have more legitimacy, and they reach a wider audience. And we must invert this balance in which their speech is treated with less care, and we should treat them with more care, and the punishment should be more strict, because they carry more, what they say, carry more responsibility. So that's the second thing I'd like to point out. The third thing is WhatsApp. You know, in 2018, there was a big WhatsApp problem, and it hasn't been addressed. People are just hoping that this technology becomes outdated, and then we have a new problem. So we now face the new problem. But WhatsApp groups are very active. There was maybe, you know, the political campaigns were about to shift from WhatsApp to Telegram, but now with Telegram, you know, abiding by the rules from the Electoral court, maybe not. Maybe they stick to WhatsApp, because WhatsApp has some protections. Viral messages cannot be identified. And there is a big debate in civil society on how to address that. There was this proposition that we should implement traceability of viral messages. Only viral messages, only messages that are in the public sphere, protecting the privacy of interpersonal communication, one-to-one communication, or one-to-many, many-to-one communication. But when it comes to viral messages, which is just one-to-many, we should have a way to find who's spreading those messages, so we can persecute those kind of misinformation spreading strategies. But nothing was done. It was so controversial. Privacy advocates didn't like it, because it will mean that we'll gather metadata from users. There was another proposition that didn't gather any metadata from users, which was basically to block forwarding messages to multiple users. That will block the problem in WhatsApp either, but there was no support for it either. So WhatsApp is a big problem. There are some solutions on the table, but they're too controversial, and maybe nothing happens in the election in October, because we don't want to, you know, to adopt controversial solutions. So this is the third thing that we could do to minimize the problem of misinformation in the elections. And the fourth thing is, platforms should enforce good policies against challenges to electoral integrity, not only during, but also before official electoral campaign starts. You know, we have our own version of the big lie narrative. David talked about, Claire talked about it. And this is a big problem. YouTube just changed policies to address part of the problem. You cannot challenge the integrity of the past elections. But the problem is, a big part of the problem is that people are challenging this election, 2022. They're saying that we cannot trust, you know, the electronic ballots. So we must find good policies and adopt them across platforms, on YouTube, on Facebook, on Telegram. We must find a way to address this problem before it's too late. Not only the past two 2 months before the election, but right now, because the campaign is gaining momentum and it's growing and growing, and we must do all those 4 things won't solve misinformation problem, but they certainly can minimize. If we don't put money into the offices that are spreading misinformation, if we control or find a way to find who's spreading misinformation on WhatsApp, if we find a way to control and to punish what politicians do regarding misinformation, if we find a way to impose policies again, challenging electoral integrity right now, from right now until the elections in October. If we find a way to do those 4 things, we can minimize the impact of misinformation in the next Brazilian elections.
Thank you very much, Pablo, and thank you very much for mentioning very actionable items. I think I'm going to follow up a little bit on what you said. I'm going to ask for the 3 of you. We know that even though Claire mentioned that the platforms were slow to adopt or to be more forceful in relation to the 2020 elections in the US, they were. And the deplatforming, you know, when it got close to January 6th, they started being more active. They did a lot of deplatforming, which had important consequences in maintaining the order. I want all of you to comment, if you can, how are they acting in Brazil? The big players are talking Google, Facebook, WhatsApp, YouTube, Instagram, and how do you see their action, both political and like their preparedness to these elections?
I'll quickly start because I don't know enough about the detail, but I'll say, Natalia, they didn't do anything until the 7th of January. And then you had this domino effect where basically all the platforms started deplatforming. And the thing is, whilst I think there might be some of us who are like, yeah, I really struggle with the fact that there's no transparency around the decisions that they make around deplatforming. So one thing that Brazil should be doing is setting up an independent advisory group full of historians, ethicists, and other people to say, we need transparency. If they're going to make decisions about deplatforming, it shouldn't be happening the day after a projected coup, just because they're following each other. We saw it at the beginning of the Ukraine invasion. They didn't have policies in place around Russia Today, and they were just copying each other like, oh, maybe we should now do this. So I would say that that's the least of what the platforms should be thinking about, which is how can there be any kind of transparency around that? Because otherwise they're just making decisions without any oversight.
Anybody else?
I agree with Claire, and it's very unclear how they're acting to fight misinformation. So as we know, the Electoral Court with Justice Barroso tried to create this sort of agreement where all the platforms would make compromises to fight misinformation, but then it's very frustrating when we have companies like Google saying that one way to fight misinformation was to promote a doodle to celebrate the election day in Brazil. How in the world would this fight misinformation? There are tons of studies out there saying an efficient way to fight misinformation is to identify super spreaders and deplatform them. This is something that these platforms can easily do because they have internal data to see which are the largest accounts that are, spreading whatever kind of information. They can identify that, especially now. Telegram just wrote back finally to the Supreme Court saying that only 100 public channels are responsible for 95% of the public data on Telegram. 100 channels, these are super easy to monitor. So why aren't they monitoring these platforms, these groups? Pre-bunking, also quite easy. They can identify when misinformation is about to leave the underground of misinformation creation to the surface, which is Twitter and YouTube, and they don't do anything about it. So the solution almost seems easy to identify, but when you don't have the other side engaging and making compromises to act on this, then it gets really hard to hope that they will actually do something to decrease the share of misinformation.
Pablo, do you want to comment?
No, I think the platforms aren't doing much. I mean, I pointed what I think they should be doing, but they're not doing much. I think we should have a plan and put a lot of pressure on them, because there are some things that they could do very easily, as David just pointed out. And we must pressure them now, because we're in April, we only have a few months, and the sooner we do it, the better.
Do you talking about like the activity and the debate around the PL das fake news? So the platforms have been very active in that debate, and I'm not sure how much they weighted in like the decision for the urgency not to be approved. What's your vision, and now specifically for you and David Nemer, about the PL of the fake news as it is, and can it actually help in any way with fighting fake news?
I think there are, you want to talk first, David?
No, you
Sorry.
please, Pablo.
I think the fake news, the so-called fake news bills, there one thing there that really could help is the way it treats politicians, but it's doing just the opposite of what it should do. We should be harsher, have clear rules, and should apply them with more, have those rules apply more strictly to politicians, and it's doing just the opposite. So it has a really bad effect. The platforms don't want this bill because it's going to cost them money. They'll have to give money to media companies. They'll have to do moderation more carefully. A lot of things that requires money. They'll have to give out information they consider commercial secrets in the transparency report, so they don't want it, and they've been very aggressive in Congress trying not to pass it. And they're not the only ones fighting against it, but they were a major player fighting against it.
Yeah, I agree with Pablo. In this fake news, so-called fake news bill, there are things that we might consider, and I think it's productive, and it's far from being perfect, but it's something that will get us to talk about regulating these platforms. But I agree with Pablo, and just to explain to the American audience that might not be understanding why we should go harsher on politicians, because the actual super spreaders in Brazil are politicians. We do have our Marjorie Greens of Brazil. We do have the Matt Gaetz of Brazil. We have all these people mimicking this behavior because they have realized that it's a huge market that they are conquering. So this is why we need to go harsher instead of lighter on politicians, because they have understood that these platforms are a battleground that they want to conquer as a way to maintain their base, supporting them, and also as a way to capitalize on votes, in coming up elections. So this is why this sort of a thing that showed up in this fake news bill is just unacceptable and should not be part of this conversation, at least for now. Maybe later, but for now, it should not be part of this.
Okay, I have a couple of questions of mine. They're like 3 or 4, and then I'm gonna go to the audience. We already have lots of questions. One is very specific about the Brazilian elections. Now, the recent polls have shown that the race between Bolsonaro and Lula seems that it's going to be tighter than it was previously believed. My question is, if you, any of you who want to comment, think that if the race is tighter, does it affect fake news production, and in what way? Sorry, misinformation. Claire always tells us that we should not use the word fake news.
I'll go quick here, if I may. It will increase the amount of misinformation and disinformation campaigns, because the tighter is the difference, the bigger is the space for people to contest the outcome of the elections. And the only way that Bolsonaro and his group and Klein have found to contest the elections is through misinformation. So the more doubt, the more questions you bring through misinformation, the more agitated you get your base to fight for your beliefs or whatever you want to gain with those misinformation. So the answer is yes.
Do you want to comment, Pablo or Claire?
I totally agree. The tougher the race, the more opportunity it will give to Bolsonaro to contest the result.
I'll just jump in and say another lesson from the US is that there's a lot of emphasis on misinformation into the lead up to an election. Does it suppress the vote? Are people concerned about harassment at the polls? But of course, what we also saw in the US, which was it seemed closer than it ended up being. But in places like Arizona and Pennsylvania, that's where we had those recount. And then we had misinformation about the recount, like Sharpie Gate, like people were using the wrong pens. And so I would also argue that are journalists prepared? Are election officials prepared? Are the technology platforms prepared for potential like these periods of interregnum? So I think it's another lesson that we have to learn, which is it's not just the lead up to who are you going to vote for, it's what happens during the vote count. And I would just really make people prepared for that, because we weren't prepared in 2020 for that time, and we certainly weren't prepared for the 2 months of the big lie.
Thank you, Claire. Following up on that, now it's a question that Sidney wanted to ask. So in the last elections, the right-wing and Bolsonaristas were very masterful at using like misinformation channels and coordination right before the election. And it seems that, Haddad was kind of caught off guard. Do you guys think that the left wing has progressed in the use of social networks to actually campaign in compared to the Bolsonaristas? And that's for David and Pablo.
So one challenge with that question is that, so to answer that question directly, yes, the folks in the left spectrum have appropriated technology and social media to engage with their base. So, for example, Manu Davila, she's amazing with her Telegram channel, her Instagram presence. However, the left, or the progressives, or whatever we want to call, they're put in a position where they're not allowed to break the rules to compete. Whereas the other side, the far right, like Bolsonaro, they're constantly breaking the rules of the game. So it's hard to compare them when one side, we're not expected to have anyone following the rules. On the other side, they have to follow the rules. They're always going to start at a disadvantage compared to the other group. So this is why we often see that the left has not kept up with the digital campaign or their digital presence. But I say the contrary. It's just that they have to comply with the rules, whereas the other side can't or doesn't. But that doesn't mean that they cannot reinvent themselves. But the challenge is much bigger than the other side that doesn't have to do with any challenge and not even rules. So I think it's a challenging question. And I just want to make sure that we recognize the work done on the other side, that they are trying to occupy the digital space. It's just hard because they have to follow the rules.
Pablo, do you have any comments?
No, I'll just say that what concerns me is that there are incentives for the left to play dirty this year. There are huge incentives. And I worry about how the left is going to react, because they think that they were maybe too naive. Well, I mean, a part of the left. And I fear that the election this year might be dirty on both sides, just because the left has a lot of incentives to do it. Because if the other side is doing, I should do it as well.
Actually, this is a very good point that I want to follow up. And you talked a little bit about the economic incentives. And I wanted all the three of you to please explain to us, what are the economic incentives and how have they changed from 2016, 2018, 2022 now? Because at the same time, there is law enforcement in Brazil investigating fake news. There is also more journalism being done and people shifting from platform to platform on one side. On the other side, at least in the US, but also in Brazil, it's increasing. There seems to be an economic incentive to like being more official misinformation websites. And we see, for instance, a major radio station, Jovem Pan, who is actually, spreading misinformation. So how has the economics of producing misinformation changed in the past 2-3 years?
Well, I'm happy to start to say that on one hand, there are similarities. People, you might remember the Macedonian teenagers in 2016 that were making money. Like, there is money to be made off sensational, hyper polarized content because it makes you feel good and you click and the rest of it. I think one shift that we've seen is as the platforms have kind of locked down on bots and automation, you see less of the economies of foreign interference or asking kind of troll farms in other countries to interfere, because what you've actually got is people themselves. So Facebook talks about coordinated inauthentic behavior. We've actually got quite a lot of coordinated authentic behavior where you've got true believers acting like bots and doing all of that. So weirdly, like that kind of stuff, there's less finances around. There is now much, much more money being spent on kind of like dark PR firms working for politicians that, again, very hard to understand who's paying for these kind of things. But there's a bigger economy now around that stuff, which goes to more politicians doing this, but not wanting to see. I mean, some of them are overt, but there are more people who don't want to be seen like they're doing it. So they're paying PR firms and other people to do it. So the economy, there are similarities, but there are also differences, partly because of the platforms. And as you say, Natalia, there are more, regulatory forces which are changing the dynamics and tactics that people are using.
I can try to briefly describe a timeline of how misinformation has been funded in Brazil. So back in 2018, like I said, in my research, I found out that there were these funders, which unfortunately I don't have their names because they wouldn't disclose their names, but businessmen supporting activities on WhatsApp. So, I've had several folks saying that they received from 200 to 400 reais a week to either manage WhatsApp groups, to create misinformation, to create videos, to attack opponents online. And later, the names that I had access to were actually the names that were called later to testify before the congressional investigations of the fake news, which, we know Paulo Marinho, Thaís Feijó, Rebecca Felix, these were all names involved in the so-called financing of WhatsApp misinformation. But because these people got exposed, those who were not exposed, they feared to be exposed by, by folks who were telling that they were financing people to produce misinformation for WhatsApp. With that, these people stopped funding these people to produce misinformation for WhatsApp. But those people who were paid to produce misinformation, they saw that as a huge market. So that was 2018. Then 2019 and 20, we started seeing these misinformation websites popping everywhere and monetizing through, as Pablo said, Google AdSense. So they were trying to bring users and the human traffic from, not the human traffic, sorry, the traffic of humans in these platforms from WhatsApp to these websites, kind of like what the Macedonian trolls did by bringing traffic from Facebook to their websites. So that was happening quite often. And in Brazil, we had the start of the sleeping giant that was started in the US, but it got really big in Brazil, and they created all kinds of campaigns to demonetize these websites. So these people who started monetizing on Google AdSense, they didn't stop. In 2001, then we started seeing them migrating to YouTube to monetize over each view, each click that they would get from bringing people from WhatsApp to YouTube videos and YouTube channels. Right now, this is how they're monetizing and making money. There is a bet, and that is to monetize over Telegram channel. Pavel Durov, who is the CEO of Telegram, has said once that owners of public channels would get a cut out of the ads shown up on their public channels. But Pavel Durov is someone that you can't really trust without what he says. So he said that already, he took it back. So we don't know what are the actual plans, but the current bet from the far-right groups is to go to Telegram, build massive channels, hoping that ads will show up in their channels that they can monetize as well as YouTube, for example. I mean, they don't do a great job, but eventually they end up monetizing demonetizing some channels, As we know, Telegram has a very, very light hand on content moderation. So this is where the bet is for the future.
Thank you very much, Pablo. You want to talk? Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing. There is a lot of state money, a lot, because we have in Brazil, electoral campaigns are state funded, and political parties have state funding as well. So the money to be spent on an election in Brazil, it's over $500 million. So it's a lot of money. Nobody can control that amount of money. There are institutions trying to control it. There's a lot of money to do, dirty campaigning with that. So this is a major source.
Thank you very much, Pablo. And I'm going to go to the questions of the audience. I'm going to start with Cristina Tardaglia, who we all know. She's the founder of Lupa. She has worked with all of us. And Lupa is a fact-checking agency in Brazil. She's asking all of you, I think Pablo has done, but maybe he has another idea, to give one concrete action that they feel is needed and that the society, the people here, the researchers, the journalists, the people who are watching this panel can do. And I'm going to very specifically, I'm going to do it more specific to Claire, because Claire said, you said a very compelling argument that journalism is still top-down and does not allow for agency of the public. And how could that be done in journalism? And if you know of anything that has done that and has been positive, and then David and Pablo, if you have one actionable, one action that should be taken now.
So, I mean, I think some of you who know me from my time in Brazil in 2018 talked about my dream was to have a storyline in a telenovela. But I would argue that a big part of this needs to be a conversation about what's at threat if misinformation isn't handled properly. So I think rather than newsrooms taking this very hands-off, here we are, we're debunking, which of course is really, really important. But I think having a conversation about how can communities become involved in building resilience with themselves. Like, I think newsrooms should be playing a role in creating content that can be shared, doing listening sessions, like just, starting a nationwide conversation from local, regional, national level to talk about what's the risk here, what have we seen elsewhere? Because one of you talks about pre-bunking, but pre-bunking inoculation, the research shows the most effective way to build resilience is to teach people the tactics and techniques that are used by those trying to misinform, not trying to wait till after they've seen something and be like, let me convince you that you're wrong to believe the thing you're wrong. And who has the reach to do that? Like, we need a nationwide collaboration of newsrooms, community-based organizations, et cetera, to be like, we're not messing around here. This isn't just memes on Instagram. Democracy is at stake. And the only way we do this is by building resilience and recognizing there are people trying to manipulate us and these are their tactics. So I think that like a real rethinking of the way that journalism is engaging, and that's very hard to do in 6 months, but I think there are ways of bringing the audience into this conversation and having the kind of conversations we're having today. So also, I had another thing I'll put in the chat, so I'll post this, but this is something that was created, a kind of like a platform scorecard about a month before the US election. I think somebody should be doing this very quickly in Brazil and just keep hammering publicly on the need for the platforms, because they're not aligned. That's the other thing. They all come up with their own unique policies. And I think that's something that could be done very quickly.
Thank you very much. Maybe David?
Yeah, I'll go very quickly here. My one solution would be the deplatforming super spreaders. It's known to be efficient. It's known to tone down extreme speech. So I would, if I were to bet money, I would bet money on the platforming of super spreader, which is also something very easy for platforms to identify.
Pablo, you said 4. Do you want to say something else?
Yeah, I just mentioned four of my actions, but if I had to pick one, I would say good electoral integrity policies. I think we should have all the platforms to have good electoral integrity policies.
Thank you very much. Another question from the audience. Okay, the far right, let me find it. Okay. Okay, it's from Roberta Caldo. Far-right Brazilian politicians are moving to Getter and then to Gab, etc. And they have moved to Telegram. How to monitor these platforms, and how do you think the Electoral Court can play a role in these platforms? And then I'm going to also follow up by asking if it is as much of a threat to have like a specific separated, you know, radicalized kind of bubble in the right wing in these platforms as it is in like a mass media platform such as Facebook.
I'm happy to start too, because the question is excellent, because the number of alternative platforms that are growing because of this perceived censorship by the mainstream platforms is significant. And what happens is they tend to be the feeder. So they're used as a place to like put the balloon up to test talking points and other things. So it's very easy to dismiss them, but they're actually a real engine for driving a lot of the disinformation ecosystem. So they do need to be monitored. They do not need to be reported on. So there's a real issue about giving oxygen to some of these platforms and some of these fringe spaces and rumors, which is part of what they need to survive. But I do think this case of the Electoral Court and others don't necessarily understand that they're there. They don't understand their power. They don't understand that it's not necessarily that they've got a huge audience. They end up being this engine. So again, I think there's a way to have these kind of conversations, but journalists have to be very careful about the way they report on this, because we certainly saw massive problems in the US by being excited about 4chan without realizing that by doing that, it was giving it a legitimacy and was giving oxygen to rumors that would have died otherwise. So it's a very specific part of the ecosystem that needs to be treated very carefully.
And I agree with Claire. And the interesting thing about platforms like Getter, Parler, and Gab, for example, Gab has been around for quite some time. It failed to be the Twitter alternative, the same thing that Parler tried to do, and Getter as well. Truth Social right now is actually having a huge problem with their users are complaining that they don't have the other side, so they can go and troll them and compete with them, or no, and try to bug them. But because this is the logic of social media platforms, right? You need different bubbles touching each other, because that's why you keep them on the platform, posting and, let's say, fighting. Something about Getter, and I agree with Claire, we need to be very careful because Getter is not as big as they claim to be. There's an issue about inflated number of inauthentic accounts. Jason Miller has been failing in bringing big names to the platform, failed to do that in the US, so he's trying to do that in Brazil. He has toured in Brazil. He has met with people like Carla Zambelli and Ana Paula Volli, who are known to be the super spreader of extreme speech on Twitter, and they keep trying to bring people onto these platforms. Weird enough, Ana Paula Volli has 900,000 followers on Twitter, which seem legitimate, but then on Getter, she seems to have the same amount of followers, although not even the biggest names in these platforms have close to 200,000. So there's something very sketchy happening on Getter. I'm trying to monitor and try to understand what is happening. So I'm with Claire. We need to be very careful on how we report these, because these are all manipulated data, and things that are happening there are not quite how they quite what is actually happening. The only danger, though, so again, when we have this unified discourse kind of platforms, they tend to gravitate from the center of the public debate to the periphery. So their impact in the public debate is not as big as it was before, but the danger is that they create this uniform way of engaging with speech that they tend to become more radicalized in those spaces. So this is why it's important to monitor them, because that's where we see the most extreme behaviors coming, from these, outside bubbles. But I wouldn't say that they would have as much of power as people on Twitter, for example.
There is a question for Professor Nemer, very specifically, from Professora Rosiane Tavares of the Federal University of Alagoas, and of course, if the others feel that they want to comment as well. Good afternoon, Professor Nemer. Nemer, thank you for your talk. Could you please comment about the relationship between misinformation and the increasing use of violent language in Brazilian social media and outside of it? So it's a question about language, even if it's not misinformation, but language is getting more and more violent. And, you know, when we spend enough time in social media, we see that. So what is needed to address that issue, violent language, this fueling the polarization?
And I think this is a question that, like, all of us can address in a way, because it's basically a behavior that we see happening in these insulated bubbles on the internet, right? So in these WhatsApp groups and Telegram groups that I monitor, yes, language has become more intense and more extreme, because once you share misinformation that is loaded with some sort of hate, these people get desensitized. And another way to maintain them motivated to fight for, let's say, Bolsonaro, the next misinformation has to become a little bit more hateful. And then they get desensitized, and then they need more hate, more hate. So it's a never-ending game, and a very dangerous game when you have misinformation and hateful content tied together to maintain your base together. So this is why, like I said, I think Gather, Parler, and Gab, platforms that, although may not have a huge impact in the public debate, but they do have the dangerous risk of radicalizing those people in those closed off bubbles, because discourse and speech become more intense and more extreme and more aggressive. Hence what we saw in the insurgency in January 6th. And this is what we're actually seeing building up in Brazil as we lead to the elections.
Okay, we've got a lot of questions. So the next one is an interesting one about but we've got so many that I've got to find it. So shaping world views. Yeah, it's in Portuguese, so I'll have to translate. And it's by Bruno Ribeiro Campos, saying that in Brazil, we start to vote at 16. But there is less and less youngsters who are willing to vote. So in these elections, people like in these elections, we're going to vote or going to be able to vote people who were 12 when Bolsonaro was elected. And they've been using, you know, TikTok, WhatsApp, Instagram, maybe. Do you think that there is, do you think that there is any relationship between the lack of voters, young voters, with their use of social media, and how do you see them, how do you see their, you know, inauguration in the public sphere by using these particular kinds of social media? And I'm going to ask David and Pablo. Pablo is good because he has very young sons.
I can comment that. I just wrote an article about age. And one of the things that when we revise the literature about political participation is that political participation increases with age. So people start participating when they're 16 and they increase until they get too old, and then they decrease when they get too old and they cannot move, they cannot vote. So whatever number you look as voting, political affiliation, party affiliation, reading political newspapers, it increases with age. So in a sense, young people not participating in politics, it's a common and widespread phenomenon. On the other hand, their participation is below the historical level. So they don't participate much, but they're not participating in a much deeper sense. This year, why is that so? And there are a lot of hypotheses. Maybe it has to do with the pandemics, but maybe it has to do with the political environment that is very overcharged. There's a lot of political polarization. It's not an environment that is inviting for the younger generations.
Natalia, please.
I just wanted to make a follow-up question because you said it's very interesting. Said they're participating in a very deeper, in a way deeper sense. Could you elaborate on that?
No, I mean, there are less people voting or registered to vote this year than in 2018. Their level is not very high, teenagers, but this year it's lower. There was a big campaign, now the numbers are increasing. Maybe with this huge effort that civil society is doing, the media is campaigning, maybe we reach to the level of the 2018 election, but the level was very low originally. And we do know, maybe it has to do with the pandemic, maybe it has to do with the political environment. My bet, it has to do with the political environment. It's not inviting for people. I don't want to vote.
You should vote, Pablo.
I agree.
I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
I agree with Pablo, especially the younger generations, compared to the older generations, where older generations tend to be more conservative in terms of their wishes for political figures, whereas younger folks tend to be more aspirational. They bring more hope. They want these politicians to bring change, whereas the older folks want these politicians to maintain the status quo. But when we are in a political environment, as Pablo said, that there's very few reasons to be hopeful for, the environment's awful. The country's in an unprecedented crisis in many levels. So we are destroying people's capacity of hope, of hoping. So when you take that away, then the younger generations do not feel compelled and motivated to vote, because if they are voting for change and change is not coming, then why bother then? But like Pablo said, go vote. Don't let hope die. Hope is the last thing to die, as we say in Portuguese. So keep fighting. As Paulo Freire says, keep fighting to maintain hope alive.
If I can just jump in, I completely, hearing this makes me very sad, but it reminds me of lots of things. But I think it goes back to a national conversation about what there is to lose. Because I think it's, if we're just like, oh, it's the same old politicians fighting, when I actually think that we're at a new level now. It's not just the same old politicians fighting, it's about losing democratic, systems, freedoms, et cetera, et cetera. So, but that's going to require a national conversation that is different than the one that we've had up until now.
Thank you very much. Gabriel has a great question, but it's in Portuguese again, so it's making my job a little bit harder. How do we deal with the case of local radio stations or evangelical Christian radio stations that spread misinformation, but specifically through authority, religious authority? And what is the role that they're going to play in these elections? And is there any way to fight back against that?
Well, I think not only local radio stations, but mass media in general has a part in this problem. We're seeing Jovem Pan News, you mentioned Natalia earlier, which is a big, I think it's the biggest or the second largest radio network in Brazil. They have some, some shows that are really concerning. And CNN, we have seen misinformation there. CNN Brazil, we're seeing in Record, which is a big TV network. And I think mass media now is part of the problem. In the US, there is Fox News, and in Brazil, we have also mass media problems regarding disinformation. They're usually not on reporting. They're more on opinion panels and opinion shows, but it's a big problem. And part of the problem is that because we used to think that the misinformation is concentrated on hyper-partisan websites, and it's not anymore. Maybe it's never been concentrated on hyper-partisan websites. It's all over, and this is very delicate because there is a lot of economic power. The professional media who's not doing this. They don't want to touch this because it's might sound like censorship. It's very delicate, but we should look at it and we should face this problem because mass media is part of the problem too. That's very clear.
Thank you very much. This is actually a question by Peter Ginsburg, and then I would like both of you to develop on that. What is the role of mass media, traditional media, as well in the spread of misinformation?
I can take a stab on this. So studies have shown that the community newspapers and community radio, they have been very efficient in debunking nationwide misinformation agenda. So they're very effective because the locals have a very important trust with their local, the community newspaper or the community radio. It becomes a larger issue when they are engaging in misinformation because it's like losing an ally to join the, the bad forces. And yes, now in Brazil, we're sort of importing the American way of doing cable news where the topic is the world round or is planet Earth round? And then you have to have one side agreeing and the other side disagreeing as if they belong to the same space of debate. This shouldn't be the case, right? And the same thing we've had, of course, I'm joking about the Earth, but we've had debates like that about the vaccines of whether or not we should, promote vaccination against COVID. So this is a dangerous ways of engaging with information that leads to disinforming people. Unfortunately, I don't study local newspapers or community radio, but I do know that they are very good in dismantling misinformation. So maybe engaging with them in a responsible way could be a good way out.
Yeah, and I'll just add on that quickly. Last year, I did an analysis of the way that Fox, MSNBC, and CNN amplified Trump's tweets, because the platforms aren't perfect, but they have labels, which also aren't perfect. But we actually used kind of computational analysis to pull down the times that tweets were blown up on screen with no labels, nothing else, just reinforcing of the rumors. And we looked at specifically the ones that Trump was talking about, mail-in ballots being fraudulent, et cetera, et cetera. So as everybody's talked about, when you've got politicians who are spreading misinformation, even newsrooms that are trying to be responsible, the challenges of reporting on that, doing it in a way that doesn't reinforce the rumor, how do you effectively fact check in real time? We don't have that ability yet to, if people are giving speeches, to do that on television. So I think there's also something that needs to be done around how, particularly in broadcast and radio, what does it look like to do real-time fact checking? We don't have labels, we don't have other ways that we put things on screen, we don't have a visual language. So even that is a challenge of how do you, you either ignore the politicians that are lying, but then that leads to claims of censorship. So it is harder than ever to do journalism. And journalism has always worked on this idea of more sunlight is a disinfectant. The more we report on something, we show the truth. Well, the problem is bad actors have weaponized that idea by weaponizing journalists to essentially do their work for them because they have the audience. So there's so many things we've talked about. There's the idea of newsrooms themselves pushing false information, but they are trusted. But there's also the challenge of simply how do you report when you've got very serious public figures spreading lies. And I'll use the L word.
Very good. Very, very nice to use the L word. I have two more questions and then we're going to close. Andrew Woods asked in English, and it's a very interesting question. What is the role of revisionist history? Claire touched a little bit about this, but such as YouTube documentaries of Brasil Paralelo in shaping the worldview that is more receptive to misinformation about Brazilian politics. And there is a huge debate or a huge fight in Brazil right now about the legacy of the dictatorship, and there is a lot of revisionist actors. So how is that, what is the role of revisionism right now in terms of fake news spread? And the question is, what's the role of revisionism in shaping worldviews, but also how can we fight against it? Claire, do you want to start, or David?
Okay, I'll go. Okay, I'll go. It's very, very concerning, because now we've had reports of public schools in Brazil showing the videos, and the films of Brazil Paralelo, which contest the truth. So right now, and this is the actual problem that we're living nowadays with the production of knowledge. We've always had research institutions, universities, all producing knowledge based on rigorous methodology, on rigorous scientific methodologies, and validated across, different social worlds. And with that validation, then we have a version of the truth. But right now, we're having these media productions where they don't engage in any kind of research, they don't engage with any kind of methodology, and then they are producing some sort of truth that they want to compete with a truth that was built following all kinds of steps and rigorous methodologies to get where we got. So we are having repositories of fake knowledge fighting and putting in the same space and same level as the truth that we've always been used to engage. Not that universities or research institutes are free of problems, they are, and we contest them following rules. Whereas the other side, they don't have to follow any rules. It's all about the so-called politics, the identity politics. It's about their emotions, about what they want to change without being grounded in any truth. So I wish I had a way to say on how to fight this. But for example, in Germany, you're not allowed to contest the Holocaust. You cannot say they didn't happen, right? It's against the law. Is a lot the way in having a punishing law, a way to solve this? I don't think it's the most efficient, but I'll leave it to Pablo and Claire to see if they can bring some light. I just know that it's very problematic, and we should truly be paying attention more to this.
I think I haven't looked very closely to Brazil Paralelo's content. I've seen some of the videos, but not too much of it. But I think it's very hard to find, because it's a lot about interpreting, Brazilian history. I mean, of course, they should be debated, their vision should be contested, but to do it through applying social media platforms rules is very hard, very tricky. I don't think it is the case. I think it's a bigger job about establishing and defending what we have established as what the historians have established regarding our past. It's not. I don't think it's social media platforms' job to face that, to fight this.
Claire mentioned the recent election and how there is misinformation about the past election. Can you comment about what do you think could be done in terms of misinformation about the recent past, Claire?
I haven't got anything smart to say. I was just thinking about the revisionism question. I mean, that's basically how Putin is justifying his invasion of Ukraine. I mean, it's I don't know how we fight it, but it pulls at this idea of nostalgia and emotion in a way that, I completely agree with what you're saying, David, about what we need is, expertise. But when we're using that against this powerful sense of identity, I don't know how we change. But yeah, I mean, I think we've also seen with Putin, you can just deny. And I think it's astonishing to us to think that people would be saying things about an election that was only 4 years ago that was just factually inaccurate. But I think we just have to keep not being shocked. I think we've been so naive about so much of this. And I think, we're now realizing that these forces are much darker, and there is a power to simply denying, to, using revisionism. This is much more than just like, oh, there's some wacky memes on Instagram. I just think this is fundamental. And I think we civil society, regulators, etc., even the platforms have just not been prepared for how these technologies could be used in the way that they're being used.
Thank you very much. I think that the final one is very relevant to Brazil. The final one is from Sérgio Murilo Bocardo Ferreira. Is it possible that fighting fake news, misinformation, through the use of criminal law could backfire and end up making democracies weaker, maybe like what's happening in Russia? Could you please all answer?
I'll just say I am deeply, deeply troubled and have been for the last 5 years that we're going to get a whole host of really problematic regulation that leads to unintended consequences. And we have criticized the platforms for moving too quickly and not thinking through the implications. And I am deeply troubled. And because we don't really have a good precedent, I mean, look at GDPR from Europe did some great things around privacy and data collection, but there's also been some pretty serious consequences for GDPR. And I think the same, that whoever comes up with a model, my worry is it will then become the global blueprint. We shouldn't have, I don't think, nation-based responses in the way we're doing it. I can see people feel the need to do something, but I am deeply concerned about any sense of criminalization of this. I'm very worried about chilling effects on speech. And I do think that in 30 years' time, there's a real fear that historians are going to look back and be like, they really screwed things up. They were trying to do their best and they really screwed things up, which is what we say about Mark Zuckerberg. So I do think when it comes to regulation, it's very easy for us to move fast and break things in the same way as they have done.
I agree with Claire. And of course, as we're facing the consequences of misinformation right now, we tend to be more of the punishing attitude. And yes, we have to be careful. Technologies are developed in a much faster pace than laws and policies. And unfortunately, the bill of fake news, it has been very precise about specific technologies that in 5 years, or by the time it gets approved, it's already outdated and then can be used in very different ways and in dangerous ways. I don't believe that one size fits all in terms of technology, nor with policies. I mean, policies are an example of technology anyways. So we need more engagements. And again, I tend to say that misinformation is a multifaceted problem, a multifaceted social technical problem. Thus, we need a multifaceted social technical solution. We need all camps working together to do something about it. It sounds beautiful and happy and hopeful, but I truly do not see a way out of it if we don't have platforms, policymakers, educational institutions all working together to try to mitigate the consequences of misinformation.
I'm also not a big fan of criminalization strategies to fight misinformation. I think it's very dangerous. And however, there are some things that is, I mean, misinformation is a means to doing other things. Those things can be criminalized, and I think they should. Like organizing a plot against the democratic states in Brazil, that should be criminalized. And we have a law about that, and we should use that law if we have enough evidence that people are plotting to overthrow Brazilian democracy. So it's not about misinformation. It's about, overthrowing Brazilian democracy. I mean, democracy must defend itself.
Thank you very much, Sidney.
Yeah, so thank you very much for this wonderful conversation. Just I can't resist to say a couple of things. First of all, this last conversation about criminalization, what is failing us miserably is the political system. I mean, both Trump and Bolsonaro could be paying for what they've been doing against democracy, and the political system does not do what needs to be done. You don't even need a criminal law to punish these guys for attacking democracy the way they did. What I want to say the most is to thank Natalia for this partnership. We did 2 events together with Agência Pública during her stay here. Maybe we should talk about doing more of it. I think what we did here is in a very effective way of produce reflection on a question that afflicts us all. And it's interesting when you use this platform, taking in full consideration academic freedom and not freedom of expression. This is the space of academic freedom. So we are having a program in the last few months in Dr. class, will probably continue during the fall, which is very much politically engaged, but it's firmly based on academic freedom, not freedom of expression. People who are yelling out on Facebook are not necessarily going to be in this platform, speaking from this place. And knowledge is our basic threshold for you to be speaking here. And I think this is a way of showing commitment to knowledge and a way of fighting misinformation and misuse of the notion of freedom of expression to make irresponsible statements about whatever. So I thank you very much for this wonderful event. And I invite you all viewers to keep following Dr. Class program. Lots of good things are coming up all the time. So thank you very much. See you next time.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Bye.